Hi, and welcome to Know Who Drives Return at Boardroom Alpha. I'm your host, Joanna Macris, and today we are talking about video game maker Activision Blizzard. The company is back in the news following some board changes it announced last week, and shareholders will vote this Thursday on the $68.7 billion proposed acquisition by Microsoft. Joining us today to talk a little bit about the company and its recent governance moves is Richard Clayton, Research Director at the Strategic Organizing Center Investment Group, or SOC. Hi, Richard. Welcome.
Hi, thank you, Joanna. It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. So let's talk about a little bit about what SOC does, the organization, the campaigns, who you represent. Tell us more.
Sure. So the SOC Investment Group is affiliated with the Strategic Organizing Center, which is a coalition of a number of major labor unions who we work with to help to advise them on the SOC works advising unions on large-scale organizing campaigns. We work specifically with pension funds that are sponsored by the unions that participate in that coalition, and we look to help them protect their investments and ensure that they have the returns that they need to pay promised benefits to those members. And we do that by trying to figure out what companies need to improve their corporate governance in order to avoid the kinds of significant scandals that lead to sharp drops in shareholder value. But we also look to understand how the full range of policies that a company has in place affects their long-term performance, and to ensure that they're operating in a way which is equitable to the entire workforce and is most likely to produce the kind of long-term returns the funds we work with are looking for.
Awesome. So your organization is saying shareholders should vote no to the proposed acquisition by Microsoft. You've also been very critical about Activision Blizzard's response to the sexual harassment discrimination lawsuits, highly critical of executive compensation at the company. So, kind of in a nutshell, tell us what is Activision Blizzard doing wrong from governance?
So I think at the core of it, and this is an issue that we run into a fair amount with companies, especially companies that have been pretty successful, is that they got stuck in a situation where they had a board of directors that had been dominated by a few individuals for decades, and they never got around to refreshing the board, to bringing in new directors with new perspectives, or even just opening up important leadership positions on the board. So when we first started engaging Activision a couple of years ago, initially around what we thought were excessive equity grants for the CEO, we discovered first that 5 of the 10 directors on the board had been on the board for up to 17 years at that point, which is a pretty extraordinary tenure. But beyond that, there was a single director who at this point has now been on the board for 25 years, who simultaneously serves as lead independent director, chair of the compensation committee, and chair of the nominating and governance committee. And that's an extraordinary level of concentration of power and authority in one director, let alone one who would already be an issue and who I think shareholders would be concerned may be compromised in terms of his independence, given how long he'd been on the board. That's Robert J. Morgado. But there are several other directors still on the board with very long tenure. There are actually 2 management directors on the board, the CEO, Bobby Kotick, but also the executive chairman, Brian Kelly, who both joined Activision in the early 1990s. So our concern has been that this board of directors has been really unwilling to take shareholders seriously when shareholders are objecting to anything the company does. We've had a couple of go-rounds with them around excessive executive pay and equity grants, and rather than respond in any kind of constructive way to the critiques we were making or to the very substantial votes, including majority votes against their pay plans that shareholders delivered, the board has been, if anything, even more insulated, and actually at last year's annual meeting delayed the vote on the say on pay issue for a week in order to try to win more votes and persuade shareholders who already cast votes to change those.
So a lot of moving parts, but what are your thoughts on the recent board refresh? Like 2 female executives, what do you think?
It's a step in the right direction. It's exactly the kind of thing that I think when we first reached out to Activision Blizzard around the sexual harassment crisis back in August, that we were encouraging the board to do then. What is difficult for us to understand is why it's taken so long. Why are we, now 6-7 months later, just now getting these new appointees to the board of directors? And why was the board so reluctant for so long to recognize that it needed to be engaged in a forthright way in a refreshment process, and it needed to convey that to shareholders. So while we think these two individuals seem like fine additions to the board, at this point, there are just a lot of problems in terms of board leadership, in terms of the remaining directors who we think need to be moved off the board going forward, and in terms of the overall strategy of dealing with the sexual harassment crisis, where so far the board has just been remarkably passive and unduly willing to let current management, especially Bobby Kotick, take the lead and determine what's going to be done. We don't think that that's been an effective approach, and we think that's part of why we've continued to see executives, and particularly female executives, leave the company from senior positions over the course of the last 7 or 8 months.
Right. So, you said the 2 female board members are a step in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
More changes are needed. What do you think would be the kind of the ideal refreshment of this company's board?
Well, I think, again, we have already called for Bobby Kotick to either resign or be forced out. We believe that in addition to that, both Brian Kelly and Robert Morgado, time has come for them to leave the board. And once they've left the board, then you would have a question about, there's an open independent chairmanship, though it's right now held by an executive. There's a lead independent director position. And as I mentioned before, there's the leadership of these 2 key committees, the Nominating and Governance Committee, which is really in charge of the process of recruiting new directors, as well as the Compensation Committee. So we want to have separate directors, independent directors, maybe ideally new directors in each of those positions, so that there's a very different board leadership in place. And we believe in that case, it would be much more plausible for this board to be engaging the existing workforce at Activision Blizzard and enabling them to participate in remaking the company's culture, which is what we really think is going to have to happen for this company to be able to realize its potential value.
Right. So, in addition to yourselves, you had several members of the Senate write a letter of concern about the deal, suggesting that the acquisition would essentially sweep some of the misconduct accusations under the rug. What are your thoughts on kind of how the company is handling the situation?
Well, it's very, very strange in a lot of respects. One of the strange things I've mentioned already is the passivity that the board demonstrated between August, and they really didn't make a statement until mid-November, after the Wall Street Journal published an article which made it pretty clear that the CEO had direct knowledge of many really terrible acts at the company and was actively seeking to protect male executives from the consequences of those actions. The board didn't force Bobby Kotick out in response to that, didn't really do much of anything in response to that other than create a new committee that it assigned 2 relatively recent women director appointees to, in which then, as far as we can tell, hasn't made any further statements to shareholders about what they've actually been up to. So in our view, the company's decision to pursue, and the timing is pretty remarkable here, was right after that Wall Street Journal article was published that Microsoft and Activision began discussing this transaction. And as we argue in our letter, we believe the transaction is undervaluing Activision Blizzard in significant part because there's no acknowledgement that the depressed share price over the second half of 2021 was a consequence of the sexual harassment crisis and the board's inability to deal with it in any kind of effective or proactive way. So absent that kind of board action, it just became very easy, I think, for the current management to negotiate a transaction which would give them some kind of closure in terms of their careers at Activision Blizzard. From the disclosures in the proxy statement, there doesn't appear to have been discussions of post-employment agreements between current Activision executives and Microsoft, but they may well end up being retained in some role if the merger is approved. But overall, it just seems to us that this is not a transaction which is really providing the kind of value that Activision shareholders ought to be looking for. And there's no real motivation for the transaction in an operational or strategic way. There was nothing holding Activision back that made them need an acquisition, need a merger with a company like Microsoft to be able to succeed going forward. So we just don't believe there's a good motivation for this transaction, and that's why we're opposing it.
Also on the governance side, let's talk a little bit about executive compensation. And, the company did make some moves. Bobby Kotick took a pay cut, but on the shareholder vote, I think only 55% voted in favor of the plan. So tell us more about your thoughts there.
Yeah, so going back a couple of years when we first started this process in 2020, the issue we had with Bobby Kotick's pay was that it was remarkably high, and in particular, Bobby Kotick was getting more in equity grants than his rival CEOs in the same industry were earning on average overall. So it was a pretty extraordinarily high level of pay. And that was partly a consequence of the fact that both the ordinary equity grant program for executives had very low targets and not terribly demanding targets. But at the same time, there were multiple additional incentive plans in place that basically overlapped with the ordinary course equity grants. So by achieving a certain level of share price growth, there was an opportunity to get an even larger grant. And that was an opportunity that would exist even if the company during that time had failed to hit targets for the ordinary course equity grant program. There were similar incentives around major transactions that would generate large equity gains. So our view was that the company needed to just focus on its standard practice for granting equity to the executives. It needed to reduce the amount that it was granting. It needed to improve and make more demanding the targets that the executives had to hit. But overall, it had to be less focused on trying to reward the CEO and more focused on thinking about the workforce as a whole. At that time, we didn't know about the sexual harassment crisis within the company. We had heard issues around crush and issues around certain forms of harassment that might be affecting some minorities of workers at the company, but nothing like what was subsequently revealed. So at this point, I think going forward, while there have been some modifications to Bobby Kotick's pay, as you mentioned, the board hasn't really committed to keeping any of those in place beyond 2023. So if Activision does continue as an independent company, and unless there are serious changes at the board and in the executive suite, I think we're going to still have these problems to return to as we go forward.
Yeah. You also called on Activision Blizzard to undertake an equity review, review of its people and inclusion metrics. Tell us more about, what you'd like to see, not only from Activision Blizzard, but in general. In that.
Sure. So this is the idea here, I think, had its origin probably a little earlier than this, but publicly it was best recognized when Facebook agreed to a racial equity audit that was partly spurred by criticisms of their practices by Color of Change. And what they did was bring on board attorneys who had experience doing a lot of work advising companies around civil rights practices, but also addressing inequities in civil rights practices through their own litigation practice. So these were not necessarily attorneys or firms that the company had a business relationship previously, but where there was real internal understanding and expertise in the various different ways in which either employment practices or marketing practices or other elements of how the business operates could affect both workers at the company, but also communities that the company serves or interacts with. So that just as you could have a company evaluate its impact on racial equity, you could also have a company evaluate its impact on gender equity. And that's clearly something that would be very relevant for Activision Blizzard. So the terminology has shifted a little bit over the last couple of years. So we're now referring generally to civil rights audits more often than racial equity audits. But what this review does, what an audit like this would do, is have some people with real expertise do a very thorough investigation of multiple different business lines and practices in the company in order to develop a set of recommendations so that the company can address negative impacts that it's having with respect to civil rights, to gender equality, to racial equality, really across the board in terms of their operations.
Yeah. Why aren't more companies doing this as standard practice? Almost every executive will say, it's obvious that diversity has a meaningful benefit to our business operations, yet you don't see it standardized in practice. So what do you think some of the limitations are?
One of them is the fear of embarrassment. I think when you look at the Facebook racial equity audit, it was pretty critical of Facebook. And I think many executives are relatively thin-skinned and don't want to be taking an action, which is going to lead to themselves being criticized further. I think secondly, there are some concern. I mean, you're always going to have a concern over expenses, but I think in this case, because the firms in question are not ones which the company has already had an established relationship, I think there's some concern that things might get out of their control. And I think many companies overwhelmingly, beyond any other concern, want to avoid giving somebody else the capacity to do things which they have to respond to. They don't want to lose control of the situation. I think those are the most important elements. And I think if there's a third one, it would be, I think, a reluctance to really recognize that beyond questions of the number of diverse directors on the board or the percentage of the workforce that fits into a diverse category, that in a substantive way, the company's practices could be having negative effects on communities around the country. And I think that there's a real reluctance to acknowledge that, in part because fixing that problem could take a pretty substantial effort.
Right. We're starting to see some executive compensation tied to climate change. Are there examples of companies that are tying executive comp to diversity and inclusion metrics? And is anyone doing that or moving in this direction?
There are a few examples. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. I think Chipotle may have incorporated some of those measures. There are certainly a few others. It's a little, it's easy to understand why you would want to tie executive pay into achieving some other laudable goal. At the same time, not only is executive pay not always the best way to try to move those goals forward, but you would want to avoid, if your concern is that executive pay is already excessively high, incorporating new incentives may not enable you to actually address the overall level of executive pay, even if you're providing an incentive to achieve another laudable goal. So I think in general, we're pleased to see this connection between pay and improved diversity and inclusion, but we would want to make sure that that's part of a comprehensive approach, not just to executive pay, but human capital management of the company overall, and which is really taking into account a balanced distribution of sort of company pay and benefits across the whole workforce, including executives and ordinary line workers and so on.
Yeah. So to that point, a lot of investors are looking at what's going on at Amazon and the two New York pension funds that are very opposed to the company's treatment of its warehouse employees. Talk to us a little bit about maybe that situation and, what companies are doing, in the human capital management department, really. What's going on?
Sure. Yeah. So specifically with Amazon, I think Amazon has been remarkably unwilling to engage with shareholders. We have tried multiple times to get a meeting with a director to discuss issues around board diversity, discuss issues around health and safety, around contracting practices, without success. And we know that there are a great many other institutional shareholders that have been similarly frustrated with the company. So I think the decision by the New York City funds is informed in part by their own frustration at getting Amazon to really engage with them and getting these directors to take accountability for the company's policies and practices. Beyond that, though, just as you say, there's a pretty clear case at this point that Amazon has not been following the law when it comes to workers' ability to decide for themselves what kind of representation they want at work. Moreover, Amazon has made commitments to its shareholders that it's going to abide by the International Labor Relations International Labor Relations Organization's standards for conduct around human rights and labor rights. And that includes freedom of association. And Amazon has been actively frustrating the efforts of its employees to exercise that freedom. So I think that there are multiple concerns that tie together in the decision to pursue a vote no against these directors heading into this year's annual meeting. And unsurprisingly, we support this effort, just as we're also supporting a number of different resolutions that are ahead of shareholders are going to be able to vote on at this year's meeting, including a resolution around a health and safety report that we think is very important to get support. There's another resolution around a report on Amazon's effort to comply with the ILO freedom of association rules and a variety of others, including a racial equity audit at Amazon. So there's a lot there for shareholders to look at.
So we've talked a lot about kind of things that are going wrong or can be improved. Are there recent companies that you can talk about, or recent activities that you think have been like positive moves, on the human capital management front, or just positive, from a governance perspective?
Well, I think, sure. I think from the human capital management perspective, one of the real challenges is a lack of disclosure around a wide variety of measures that we'd like to have access to try to evaluate who's managing the workforce better than others. So absent that disclosure, it's always kind of tough to identify a company that we think is doing well. One company that's often cited at the top of lists, particularly around diversity and inclusion, is Microsoft. And Microsoft has a very strong track record in terms of board diversity, diversity among senior managers, and diversity among, and this is, I'm speaking particularly about ethnic and racial diversity among the workforce. But at the same time, Microsoft is less diverse in terms of gender. And there have been some significant red flags around sexual harassment issues at Microsoft over the course of the last year. So it's tough to tell whether Microsoft has a really strong program of human capital management that has some more work to do, or whether Microsoft has a program that's just strong in some areas and really genuinely needs a lot of work in other areas, or what the real situation is. That said, I think that there are a couple of other companies that we feel confident have been actively and proactively attempting to improve human capital management. Costco is a company that for a long time has been able to compete effectively against other retailers while maintaining relatively high wages and benefits for its warehouse workers, as well as stable schedules and other things that we think are important contributors to good human capital management in that industry. The Gap is another retailer that's definitely thought seriously about human capital management and has thought a lot about how to structure its training, the organizations of its stores, and the tasks that employees in the stores are charged with performing in a way which enables a virtuous circle that produces higher productivity and customer satisfaction. So there are definitely companies out there that are thinking seriously about these issues. It's just difficult for external shareholders to get a clear picture of who's really devoting a lot of time and effort to doing that and who's being effective in doing that. So hopefully with improved disclosure in the future, we're going to have better analysis, better data to work with, and it'll be easier for us to distinguish between companies that are doing well and companies that need more work.
So let's turn it back to the Activision Microsoft proposed transaction. The shareholder vote is coming up, also subject to regulatory review. So what insights do you have on the kind of the regulatory side of things and the likelihood that that will work?
Yeah, so I think it's an uphill fight, I think, for these companies to get the deal approved. I think it's very clear that the Biden administration came in wanting to change course on antitrust policy relative to where things have been, especially over the past 4 years, but even going back something like as much as 20 or 22 years. That meant that they have appointed people to the FTC and to the Department of Justice who have been pretty critical of past practice and want to be much more aggressive, both in attempting to break up existing companies, but also to prevent mergers, which will create, reduce the number of competitors in an industry and create more dominant firms that may have a variety of different ways of taking advantage of their size and scale in a way which transfers wealth to them at the disadvantage of other participants. So we think that that's going to be kind of tough for this deal to get approved. We also know that while over the last 2 decades, the FTC and the DOJ have generally preferred what are referred to as behavioral settlements or solutions to antitrust issues, where there's an agreement that the companies, once they merge, aren't going to take certain steps or engage in certain policies or practices for some period of time afterward. The experience with those behavioral resolutions has not been very positive. There's a widespread sense that they have been unsuccessful in preventing anti-competitive practices from reemerging. And so there is an increased emphasis on potentially a structural solution, which in this case would most likely be blocking the transaction. The structural also includes compelling the companies to divest certain assets in order to merge. Whether this means that there's any possible settlement which might combine elements of a structural resolution and a behavioral resolution, that's unclear. But I think it's going to be a pretty stringent and demanding settlement if the companies are able to get there. And it would not be surprising to us if this ends up in court with the regulator seeking to block the transaction altogether.
Yeah. And what are your feelings on shareholder sentiment ahead of the vote? And, what would you say, should be some key considerations to think about as shareholders are thinking about which way to vote on this?
So I think shareholders are definitely concerned in a general way about the sexual harassment crisis and about what implications this transaction has. So we've spoken to shareholders whose view is that while there may be real issues with the transaction in terms of the consideration being provided to the Activision Blizzard shareholders, they think of Microsoft as a company that's going to better be able to manage Activision Blizzard's workforce than the existing Activision Blizzard management. There are others who may be more skeptical about Microsoft or less willing to believe that those are the considerations that ought to sort of dominate their voting decision. But you can see that those are reasonable beliefs. I think that any time you're looking to challenge a transaction, it's pretty much an uphill effort, and that there tends to be a lot of momentum in favor of major merger transactions such as this one, in part just because of the way the capital markets have evolved and the way that merger arbitrage funds buy into a company once a deal's been announced. That having been said, we're continuing to reach out to shareholders and have presentations, and it's very clear that I think the critique that we're presenting of the financial terms of the transaction is resonating with those shareholders. Whether or not that ultimately determines how they're going to vote.
And I mean, even if it does go through, I mean, to what extent can Microsoft really change the culture at Activision? And does the company have kind of a track record of taking other, integrated companies and making those kind of shifts, beneath the surface?
Yeah, I don't think that there's a clear track record of Microsoft substantially improving human capital management practices or effectively addressing issues around harassment or diversity and inclusion as a result of an acquisition. That said, it is certainly within the realm of possibility that they might take a very different approach to what the management team and the board at Activision Blizzard have taken so far. I think we'd want to be optimistic about that. But as I mentioned before, this is a circumstance where the board has already seemed to be a little too passive in responding to reports of sexual harassment. And there's been some ambiguity about what exactly the board has known and when, and what actions they chose to take. At the same time, and on top of those, the very fact that Microsoft responded to the harassment crisis in Activision Blizzard, reaching kind of a peak last November by looking to acquire the company, rather than to think about whether this was a company they would want to continue doing business with going forward, absent significant changes. And that's the position that that Sony was taking, the other big console manufacturer. So Microsoft's view was pretty different, and that makes us a little nervous that the company may be, less driven to try to fix issues at Activision Blizzard or to try to engage the workforce at Activision Blizzard in remaking the company culture than we would want to see. But again, this stuff is really hard to assess from the outside, and it's hard to assess ahead of time. So we're focused really on this critique of the consideration, with in addition to all of the arguments that we're making about the board at Activision and their failure to really respond effectively.
Yeah. So for those that are very heavily involved in this situation, what are the next data points, next catalysts, as we move towards this transaction?
So the vote is going to be the 28th, this Thursday, and we'll probably get a report that day on the results of the vote. So we'll pretty much know whether that's going to be approved. At that point, though, things get very uncertain because there's a lengthy period of time that the regulators have to consider challenging this transaction. They've already been reviewing material for several months at this point. It may be that they're going to be ready to move forward one way or another, not too long after the shareholder vote. But the way that the merger agreement is set up, the companies really have until June of 2023 to close the transaction. Probably by that point, the regulators will have made a decision, and if they're litigating against the transaction, that case will have gotten underway. That said, those cases can stretch out for a while. So it may not be the case that even by June 2023, we have clarity on whether the transaction is going to go through. But for the moment, those are really the dates that we know, right? This Thursday, and then something like a little a year away. Somewhere in between there, I think we would be able to anticipate getting a result from the investigation by the regulators.
Yeah, awesome. Well, really appreciate your insight as we look at this very complicated transaction, and we'll be following closely. Thank you so much, Richard.
Thank you, Joanna.
Thanks for joining.